All right, welcome to the UMass football show with the Daily Hampshire Gazette. I'm Kyle Grabowski. Joining me this week is Greenfield Recorder reporter Tom Johnston. So, Tom, you went to UMass. You're somebody who's watched these games. Did you get what you wanted out of that game against BC, even in the loss?
Yeah, I think the most encouraging part was that Brady Olson looked good, right? Where UMass fan, Patriot fan last weekend, it was a lot of new quarterbacks. You got to watch Mac Jones look good. They lost. It's still a positive outtake. I think the same can be said about the BC game. As long as Brady Olson looked good in that game, and they weren't going to win the game. I think we all knew that. But the fact that they made it as competitive as it was the best I felt after watching a Walt Bell coached UMass game since he got here.
The thing I wonder about Brady Olson, and I wonder if this is a Massachusetts thing where you have people from Massachusetts wanting the Massachusetts kids starting for UMass, but I'm always somebody who's going to pose the question, is that really Brady Olson? Or if had we put Tyler Lytle in that same circumstance, if we were able to do that, is he going to give you similar results or even more even keel? Because I feel like there are people being like, oh, Brady's your guy. Brady's your guy. You've got to start him. And I think in the current circumstances that you have now, where Lytle's hurt, absolutely, Brady Olson is your guy. I think he should be the guy, certainly over Garrett Zero. And I think we got probably a little bit too much Zamar Wise last week. Like, don't get me wrong, I like Zamar Wise. I have a soft spot for running quarterbacks. But I think when you have a true freshman, you need to let that guy get his momentum and get his rhythm. But I'm somebody who I think if he's healthy, Tyler Lytle is your guy because maybe his ceiling isn't all the way there in terms of the arm talent of what Olson gives you. But I just think the things he does from a decision-making standpoint and from a leadership standpoint, that if they're both healthy, you have to go back to Lytle, especially given the eligibility stuff with Olson. The new redshirt rules allow him to play in up to 4 games and still be able to call it a redshirt. I think if you can get Brady Olson into 4 games exactly, that's your ideal plan.
Yeah, I think getting him, I think that game alone just does wonders for his confidence. He's got to be feeling good going into this week, right? Against Eastern Michigan. He's got to be feeling confident. But like you said, I think Tyler Lytle will be. Look at the Pitt game to the BC game. They protected Brady Olson a lot better than they protected Tyler Lytle against Pitt. That plays a big role in how successful your quarterback's going to be. If your quarterback's taking hits like they did in the Pittsburgh game, does it really matter who's behind there?
No, it may as well have been you or I, even though if I got hit by one 300-pound guy, I'm laying on the dirt and you have to get me out of high field in a stretcher. But I think this Eastern Michigan game presents a unique opportunity because this week Walt Bell had brought up a lot that Eastern Michigan is a mirror and Eastern Michigan is who they modeled their program after. And when you hear that initially, you're like, what the hell, Eastern Michigan? Like, no, we shouldn't want to be Eastern Michigan. But the way Walt Bell presented it as like, this is a coach that came in, they were bad his first couple of years. They were 1-2, 2-10. But then they kept the staff continuity. They recruited, they built, and then from 2016 to 2019, they made bowl games 3 out of 4 years. And I just think that takes a lot of self-awareness from Walt Bell, because if he would have come in there and been like, oh, we're going to be the best team in the country, we're going to beat LSU and things like that, you would have been like, no, that's not realistic. But looking at somebody like Eastern Michigan, that I would figure has a similar approach and similar resources, and saying, we can do that. We can bring in the right guys. We can develop a culture. We can keep our staff continuity and develop people and eventually get to a bowl game. Like, I think that's a goal you can achieve, and that's a reasonable thing to point at.
Yeah, if not to go on a tangent here, but I think Eastern Michigan was the path that UMass was looking to go on when they first went up to Division I and were in the MAC. And then they overextended themselves by going independent and thinking they could do a lot more there. And clearly it has not worked out the way they envisioned. But this is, you got to look at it. Eastern Michigan, for UMass, you just want to see some wins. I think that's the biggest thing with this team. I don't care if they're beating URI in Maine later in the year, if they're beating New Mexico State. As long as they're winning these games and you just need to win some games and get some confidence in your program. So yeah, I think Eastern Michigan, like you said, it sounds like the first time you read it, you sit there and you're like, Eastern Michigan, this is the program we're striving to be like. But then you go through it and you're like, it's a realistic expectation for this program to get to that point and to be winning games and to be making it to these bowl games and putting yourself in a position to be in these bowl games. As a UMass a graduate, that's about all you can hope for this program.
Well, they, like you mentioned with the independent, they're in an odd position in that you sort of have to crib together this schedule every year. But in terms of Eastern Michigan, like I think you can look at that and be like, okay, of the first four, because you have Pitt loss, BC loss, you look at Coastal Carolina next week, that's going to be an incredible challenge for a team that's flirted with the top 25. But you look at this Eastern Michigan game and just on name brand alone, you're like, okay, UMass could beat Eastern Michigan, especially because the game's at McGurk. You know, you have to come west to east. That's not always the easiest. But then you look at what UMass is dealing with from a health standpoint, and that really muddles things. Like Bell had said 9 starters, and he had sort of hedged a little bit and said maybe some of these guys will be ready. And from what I've seen in the depth charts they've provided to us, it looks like they're going to get Bryson Richardson back in the secondary, which is going to be a huge help. But you're missing 3 defensive linemen from a unit that already struggled to stop the run. But his whole thing has been like, this is why we recruit. We're going to get the next man up. And he may not be wrong that other than a handful of guys, the difference between who's, 2 and 3 probably isn't that stark, but you do lose a little bit of the depth.
Yeah, you definitely do. I mean, you see it with not that Vegas is the end all be all, but the line opened at 21. A lot of people liked UMass. It went up to 17, and then you announce 9 starters are out. It drops back down. It's at like 22 or something now. So it goes to show you it's tough. And again, what do we know about Eastern Michigan? They played their opening game. You play a 1AA team, right? And so
and not
they
a
handle
great
their
one
business,
either.
and not a great one either. Like a very mid-tier 1AA team, but they handle their business. They look good. They did what they had to do, and then they play Wisconsin, who, if it wasn't for that close loss to Penn State, is probably a top 10 team in the country and has one of the best defenses in the country. And they had 3 first downs in the whole game.
Yeah, when we spoke to the Eastern Michigan coach earlier in the week, he really highlighted their punt team, and they've got a great punter. Don't get me wrong, but
I'm sure they learned a lot about the punter in that Wisconsin game. Plenty of opportunities.
Yeah, it's never a great sign about how the game went when you come into your media session the next day and be like, boy, our punter was great, right?
Yeah, it says a lot about how the game went. I think their only score was on a pick 6 in the fourth quarter. It just, so what do you know about them? I mean, who knows what they're going to come in here looking like? I mean, in theory,
they've got a couple quarterbacks that they're going to play. And it's one of those things where it's like, it's not like one's a pocket guy and one's a running guy. We had sort of asked the coach, like, hey, are these the same guy? And of course he said, no, they're not the same guy. But, we don't have to change the offense, and, they have their strengths and weaknesses. And you just look at it, and then they've got a couple good running backs. But I think like what Walt Bell had said is they don't do anything too fancy. Like, it's not fancy. It's very simple. And he meant that as a compliment, and that they have made the game very simple, and they're just all about their fundamentals and execution. So if you can out scheme that, if you can be a little more talented than that, if you can be a little luckier than that, that gives you a really good shot. But if you're making mistakes in special teams like UMass did last week between the fumbled punt and the kickoff return touchdown, then I feel like that's something they're going to punish really hard.
Yeah, well, you know what they say, you got 2 quarterbacks, you don't have a quarterback. So you kind of look at that with Eastern Michigan. I looking back at the BC game last week, you have a freshman quarterback starting, you need to give him you need your defense and your special teams to come up big and give him opportunities, because you can't expect, as good as Brady Olson looked, you just can't expect a freshman quarterback to walk in and go 80 yards down the field. You look at their scoring drives from last week, they had that long drive in first, second quarter, whatever, I think in between, they got stuffed at the one where they just tried running it and didn't work. Then the second half, they scored on a shot play, but they got the ball around midfield. They got it at their own 42. So short field, you score on that. They recover that fumble at the 1. They put that one in. They get that unsportsmanlike penalty on BC. They got the kickoff. They got it at the 50. They scored on that drive. And the last drive was their best drive of the game, where they went 75 yards and scored. So if you're looking at this from a UMass perspective, if you want to be in this game, you're going to need your defense. You're going to need your special teams to come up with some plays, create some short fields for this offense to generate some points.
I'm also of the mind that I think they figured some things out in the second half, because Bell had said in the post game, he was like, I'm done babysitting. We're taking the training wheels off. And I think him showing that confidence and just saying, like, you know how to do this, let's grip it and rip it, helped a ton. And I think that's the mode that they have to start this game in, is this is our guy. We're going to put the ball in his hands. And, he threw 2 interceptions, maybe could have been a couple more, but the thing that Bell has brought up repeatedly about Olsen is he's not a mistake repeater. So I think he's going to look better because, like, Eastern Michigan's defense probably isn't as good as BC's no matter what. So you're probably going to have a little more room for error, some bigger windows, a half beat more. And if I would hope that they can try and get the ball into like OC Johnson's hands on just some ways, because he hasn't done a ton, just I think because he's a name that pops up for teams in the scouting report, so they probably shade their defenses against him. I really love the things that they did with the tight ends against BC. I think that's something that you can lean on more. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just going to be another really beautiful fall day in Amherst that I think it would be a great way to spend an afternoon.
I mean, I'd say let's hope they're going to let the students in this week. We're going to have some fun. Let the students have some fun there.
I mean, that's certainly been one of the big talking points that I think Bell has made it. I think they're sitting on the fence with both of it. You're not going to have the tailgates that I'm sure you went to, but it's not going to be the same as it was last week, where they're not doing anything. Them giving out these free parking passes, I think, is trying to make both ends happy. And that's about all you can do as an administration, is say, okay, if you really, really want to be here, jump through this small hoop to get this free parking pass. We're going to make sure there's nothing wild. I get wanting to have that level of like culpability to be like, okay, well, we had our protocols in place, but then you're also saying like, come into the game. So I just feel like you can't have it both ways as much as they're trying to. Like, either you're okay with a bunch of people gathering, which you're fine with in the stadium. Like, if all of those kids came into the stadium, you would have been like, this is great. We love this.
Yeah.
But you're not going to be held responsible for having that right next to it. I am interested to see how it bears out. If it was just the first one and people were like, yeah, it's the first one, it's BC, let's do this. And now they're like, okay, we did it. Let's do something else this weekend. But it's one of those things. I always hope it's a close game. That's all that really matters to me, is that my story isn't done by halftime.
Yeah, which happened as I covered them a couple of years. It happens a lot within some of these games. But it's good. Again, last Saturday was encouraging. It was the first time since Bell has gotten here. I don't want to keep repeating it, but it's the first time you've looked at it and been like, oh, like, they didn't just get steamrolled. BC didn't just march it down the field every single drive and score. UMass didn't just go 3 and out every single time. And I think after that Pitt game, and again, it's Pitt. It's a good team. So is BC. But after the Pitt game, you watch and you're like, is it going to be this all year again? Like, is this what we're going to have to watch all year again? And the BC game gave you that hope of, and I don't want to overcompensate for a 3 touchdown loss or whatever it was, but they look good. 17.
Well, and that's the thing. I think you have to divorce yourself from you have to use your eyes, right? If you just look at the number, but like, if you look at that team, you think like, okay, you can point out 2 or 3 moments where if that goes different, you're looking at a different ball game, instead of against Pitt, where you're like, well, if these 6 or 7 things happen, if you can limit those turning points, I think that will do it. Well, Tom, I appreciate you doing this. You can find everything that Tom and I are going to be writing on recorder.com and gazettenet.com. Feel free to subscribe, and we'll catch up with everybody later.
Thanks for having me.